Ladies and gentlemen, before we continue, I do want to remind you that this is an unclassified session. We are recording it to post it to STRATCOM's outward-facing websites. So just be in mind, and if they answer something that was not in your DIA did at, ubertopsecret.com, that is the level that we're working at. So don't please, like last time, don't try to stump the jump on this one. We're working in the realm of academia and what's open.
Yes, sir. You mentioned the Russians have real perceived and contrived threats. You didn't mention any contrived threats. Could you draw an example or two of what you think is contrived Russian threats?
Yeah, okay. So for instance, they routinely accuse us of things in Syria that they know and we know we're not doing. Right? So when I was that? Helping ISIS. I agree. It's like 30 slides and we got a bunch of backup slides.
Do you want to?
Yeah, I can. Yeah,
some pictures of the.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll give you an example here. But so they routinely do this in Syria. They accuse us of doing things that we know and they know that we're not doing. Helping ISIS is the big one. Yeah, just keep going. It's toward the back. It's going to be it's two kind of grainy black and white pictures next to each other. This was they did this to us right after. Or here it is. That's perfect. So right after, I was over at OIR running the Russian ground deconfliction cell for Syria last year for a few months, from August to October. They did this right after I left, so my successor had to deal with it. But so the Russian MOD, and I follow the MOD and MFA on Twitter and Facebook, and because you want to see what they're putting out. So in November, they posted a photo claiming to show a U.S. vehicle leading ISIS fighters out of Abu Kamal, Syria, into Iraq, right? Helping ISIS escape from Syria into Iraq. And then at some point, a couple days later, some kid in his basement or something said, "Hey, I played this AC-130 Special Ops Simulator game. That looks like the same picture." And it is the same picture. They lifted it from the game. And the U.S. came out and said, "This is a fake photo." And the Russian response was, "Yes, that was a mistake, but the U.S. still supports ISIS." So the contrived threats, the things, the interesting thing about these is they're not emotionally attached to the lies that they tell. So when you debunk the lies, they just move on. Because it costs them, 10 minutes of work to do that. And it cost us a lot of time, a lot more time to refute it definitively, to prove that it was wrong. I ran into this when I was in Geneva working the Syria support group. We had a Russia policy advisor kind of attached to that group throughout summer and fall of 2016. They accused us of shooting down one of their helicopters, or one of our groups of shooting down one of their helicopters with a Stinger, which they're not Stingers in Syria that we provided the groups. Then they said it was a tow, and you could see, there was footage of it, you could see it had an onboard malfunction. A missile on one of the fins blew up when they were trying. And we spent 3 days gathering. In the meantime, this is going out in the Russian press. It popped up in the Japanese press. The international press that the U.S. had provided surface-to-air missiles to opposition groups in Syria that had shot down a Russian helicopter. We spent 3 days debunking it, and we went down to what we call the Geneva Coordination Cell, the daily meeting with the Russians. And I handed over to my Russian counterparts as GRU colonel all the information showing, the proof that this was not us, was not one of our groups. It was a two-ship formation, onboard malfunction. You can clearly see it from the video, and he said, "Yeah, either that or maybe his wingman accidentally shot him down." And then he moved on to the next thing. We never talked about it again. But it took them 30 seconds to make up the lie. It got out in the international press. It took us days to refute it. So these are things where they're just trying to backfoot us. Right? They know we're not doing this. We used to call it in Geneva truth triage, because we'd go down there every morning, and it was this litany of things that they'd accuse us of, 8 or 10 things a day, none of which were true. And we'd go back up to the UN mission, or the U.S. mission to the UN, and we'd say, all right, which of these can we just ignore because we don't have the time? And which of the 2 or 3 that are so egregious that we have to refute these? We have to triage. These are the cases we've got to deal with now because we can't let them get out. And so this was how we would spend about half a day every day, is just responding to the lies the Russians would tell about us or to us over Syria. And so I mean, if you look at it from their perspective, why would you not do this?
Great return on investment.
Yeah, you're not constrained by the truth. You know, you can, the world's your oyster. You can make up any story. And I mean, we have some videos in here that, you know, I'll show them to you. There's some great Russian internet propaganda videos that are out there. All of them have a little grain of truth, and they're believable to people who are inclined to believe that type of thing. So I would say those are some contrived things. We all know that we're not doing these things, but it costs them almost nothing to use.
Interested if you think the withdrawal from the INF Treaty is the right move with the Russians and what's the next step?
I'm getting ready to, so short answer is I don't know. I mean, I'm getting ready to do some research on this, and an article underway called, you know, A Farewell to Arms Control. That's my title. That's all I have. Because, you know, they withdrew from CFE, we withdrew from ABM, we've withdrawn from INF, they've now suspended implementation of INF. New START expires 2020. You guys probably know way better than I do. New START expires soon, in a couple of years. The whole arms control regime is collapsing. You know, if you're the president saying in the State of the Union, basically, if you want an arms race, we'll arms race, and we'll outspend you and out-innovate you. Okay, I mean, we've done that before. We did it in the 80s. There's risk to that. So this is something that we're interested to discuss with your experts afterwards. What do you know about Russian violations? And I know what our, I know what the kind of U.S. public government position is, but what is there on Russian violations? Would they violate a treaty? Absolutely, 100%. Absolutely. If they thought they could get away with it, or if it's not in their interest anymore to abide by it, they'll just violate it. And if they get caught, they'll either deny it or they'll make some justification for it. I certainly think it's likely that they violate it. Knowing what that means for whether our response was the right one, I need to do some more research to know.
Back to back.
So I'm hearing a little bit of an intersection of thought, and I just want some clarification on your opinion. I recognize this we're asking, but so you talked a little bit about influence, Russian influence, and so I'm interested. Do you believe that Russia is winning in the influence environment? And I'm asking that. That's a loaded question. So if that is yes, you made some comments about like operationally, they're competent, though they have some effects recently that might show that they've lost their only aircraft carrier, etc. In that line of conversation, you mentioned that we have to be careful not to spin cycles, chasing things that we shouldn't be spinning cycles on. But I'd like to go back to a comment that you made on the first portion, which was that it's kind of scattershot, and that they're just kind of reaching and they're all over the place. So I'm trying to figure out if this. I'm at this intersection of if it's scattershot and you're running a triage, are you not spinning cycles, worrying about things that you shouldn't be spinning cycles on?
Yeah. I mean, so I think yes, we tend to do that. We tend to respond to what offends us the most, not to what what other audiences might be most influenced by. And so I'll put in a little plug for a RAND report that came out in 2016 called The Fire Hose of Falsehood. It's a report on kind of Russian information operations. And it's nice and concise. It's, I don't know, it's 14, 16 pages. But what RAND says about Russian information operations is high volume, right? So it is a fire hose, and it just comes at you all the time. Multi-channel, so social media, broadcast news, face-to-face interactions, statements at the United Nations, all these things, and then no commitment to consistency, which I think they'll say this, then they'll say something that completely refutes the statement from before. If you look at, I think the UK government did a great kind of chronology of Russian excuses for the Skripal attack, and it's really it really hits home on this kind of no commitment to consistency. If you look at MH17, the same thing. I mean, they've claimed multiple different things of what happened to MH17, so high volume, multi-channel, no commitment to consistency, and no commitment to objective fact, which is an academic way of saying they make stuff up.
So then just a quick thought, then to me that sounds like noise. And so I personally don't believe they're winning in the information environment. And your first comments I really hung on, which was noise and scattershot in order to distract and to reduce our efficiency with our forces. And I'm really listening for the one thing that they go after that has true credence that they stick to. And that's the intersection I'm at, where I hear the noise, I see the volume, but I can't quite pull out the effectiveness compared to what the U.S. You mentioned all the litany of allies that we could list, and then the allies that Russia could list. So who's winning the information environment?
I'll just say one thing, and then I'll turn it over to Barbara. What I think we need to do is figure which audiences, decide which audiences we care about.
Sure.
Who do we care about? So if they want to influence, a group that we're not, either they're beyond our ability to reach anyways, or they're just not of critical importance to us, fine, have at it. If they're audiences that we care about, then we need to know, we need to be able to refute the Russian disinformation. Now, what that means is, we're going to work 10 times as hard to refute something as they didn't create. So let me.
Yeah, and I think very quickly dovetailing on what Bob said. So, if you were to look at perhaps an audience in Belarus, do we want to try to refute some of the propaganda influence operations on the audience in Belarus as Russia demonizes the West to the Belarusians? Well, sure, it'd be great if we had unlimited bandwidth and resources, but I don't necessarily think that we're going to make a lot of inroads into Belarus. We send the USAV band there, and we call that a victory, and we move on. On the other hand, on audiences and population in NATO member states, well, that's probably a worthwhile counter, because these are our allies, and one of the most critical things that we can do is to build up and strengthen the NATO alliance and the potential response against Russia as an alliance. So that's pretty important. You asked what are the one things that they kind of, where is there something where there's a grain of truth that they grab hold of, and I will give you one example, and you can come up with a lot of examples, but look where we establish the say-do gap. That is, we say one thing, we espouse one thing, and we do something else. Okay? So a great, a line that the Russians use a lot is we're in Syria illegally. Well, we are. I don't know. Now, do we have national interest there? Is there a reason to go there? We can have those conversations all day long. But Syria invited the Russians and the Iranians to come in and assist the regime in fighting both ISIS and these groups that were, counter to the regime, trying to overthrow the regime. And Iran and Russia answered their ally and came to Syria and assisted. The United States has no international legitimacy being within the boundary of a sovereign nation. Do I think that we needed to go there and do what we did? I certainly do. I'm not an apologist for Russia. But if you're Russia, that's the only piece of that puzzle that you throw up. We're there legally, they're there illegally. The United States does not abide by international law, no matter what they say. So they are able to take things like that, and that's what they use to influence those audiences. Bob talked about a grain of truth. There, many of the things, some of them are lies by whole cloth, but many of the things there is one small grain of truth, and if people want to believe it, they'll pick that grain of truth, and that's what they'll stake it on.
Thank you.
Just a comment on that. I mean, one of the things we can do, and we probably are doing it, is to discredit the Russian sources. Have these compilations of lies put out and say, RT says this, it's all BS. Therefore, anytime a European sees RT, if they've read the report, they're going to look at anything the Russians say for that meeting as suspect. So at least that's one way we can counter it.
Yeah, the EU's doing a good job of this. In fact, they have you can sign up for it in email. I get it in my Gmail account every week, and it's called, I forget the exact name, but it's an EU STRATCOM task force that refutes Russian disinformation. Every week, they take a couple of examples and just unpack them. and just kind of and expose them as lies, and it's very well sourced and everything, and it comes out every week. And so the EU started to do this. I think we should do something. We should do the same.
So my question is, you spoke about how Russia wants a sphere of influence and a buffer space. How are they going to handle the fact that they are a sick man compared to China, which was their sick man throughout the Cold War? Now they have to look at China as being domestically better than Russia ever was during the Soviet Union days. So I see that Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin have a bit of a relationship, but what is your professional insight on what that relationship looks like and how it's going to be going forward?
Bob and I have talked off and on about this. Just anecdotally, my experience living in Russia, I have never met a more xenophobic people. And much of that xenophobia is focused on both the people from the Caucasus, but as well Asians as well. And I mean, I won't go into the litany of things that they say about China and all the jokes about China and all that other stuff, but the bottom line is, I sincerely believe that China is more of a natural adversary to Russia than the United States. The question is, at what point will Russia realize that? Sorry, I got my Homer Flood voice in there. So just an example, traveling through Siberia, I went into a couple of villages and would start speaking Russian, and I realized that they weren't Russian speakers in the villages. Because due to Russian demographic collapse, many of the villages have been abandoned in Russia as the older population dies off, the youth leaves the rural areas and goes to the city, so there are lots of little abandoned villages. Well, the Chinese have cut most of the lumber and resources and all that sort of stuff down in China. So they started by walking across the border, cutting down trees and dragging them back into Russia. Yes, thank you, into China. And then they went, why are we doing this? So they built lumber mills, and now they cut down trees. Whole swaths of Chinese population have, I call it a stealth invasion, have gone into Siberia, all along the border. They're cutting down trees, they have built a lumber mill, and they're sending processed lumber back into China. This is happening every day. But from the Russian perspective, it sounds like the Russians don't know that it's happening. From the Russian perspective, that's out there. Right now, in the West is using the CIA to foment color revolutions, and they want to undermine and overthrow our regime. So China can have the lumber. So it's a function of what they see as the immediate threat.
They're going to ignore a real threat to receive.
I think so, yes. And to the extent we can avoid fomenting a Russian-Chinese alliance, because that's always been kind of one of the major kind of negative interests in U.S. security documents, is prevent a Russian-Chinese alliance against the United States. To the extent we can avoid enabling that, I think we should. We've done a pretty good job recently of enabling it, really, to be honest, I think. But I mean, the story about Siberia, I think, puts it in a nutshell. The long-term threat is for Russia really is China, but they don't see it there.
They have already got competition in the Central Asian states for the hydrocarbon resources, lots of new pipeline builds that are heading east instead of west, that are not adding into the Russian supplies. I mean, and of course, once the Chinese, especially with One Belt, One Road, once the Chinese establish those pretty significant economic, financial interests in the Central Asian states, political interests can go right on their heels.
Sir, can you talk a little bit about the demographic issue you talked about? There's no Russians decline demographically. Does that make them more of a risk to us and our interests in the near term, and then mid to long term they'll just kind of mellow out because they'll realize they won't have to, get the means or people to do what they set out to do? Or do you think there's going to be a long-term recurring risk because of lower demographics? So there's and Bob's probably got a more refined view of this. I'm of a couple different minds on this. It's my own personal schizophrenia. As the West finally mobilizes and kind of starts to take a stand against Russia's more egregious actions, whether that's the EFP from NATO going in, or the rotational brigade, or economic sanctions, or diplomatic isolation, whatever that is.
each of these successfully weaken the Russians step by step, incrementally. Whether the Russians are willing to endure it or not, completely different aspect. But if you look at that every day that we keep these sanctions in, economically they're a little bit weaker. And if you look at it demographically, if you were sitting in the Kremlin, perhaps you would say, you know what, tomorrow I'm going to be weaker than I am today. The West is getting stronger, I'm getting weaker comparatively. I think that puts us at some risk, especially as Russia long-term, and I do believe their long-term prospects are a declining power, and just about everybody says that, so I'm not breaking new ground here. But you look at a couple different aspects. So, help me out with these numbers. Female life expectancy in Russia, 76, male 72? Or 62,
Yeah, males are
62.
still 60s.
Yeah, 62.
But I think it's, yeah.
So, and they just changed the pension law in Russia that said you can't draw a pension until 63. Did I get that right? It's a one-year difference.
60 for women, I think it's 65.
Okay, so 65. So that means the male life expectancy is 64. You can draw your pension in Russia when you're 65 as a man. So,
Which a lot of people aren't happy about.
yeah, that caused some unrest. But that so they're not in as much of a demographic collapse as they were, but they're in a long-term demographic decline that is probably unrecoverable, especially if you just look at the ethnic Russian population. That's the critical piece of this. So Russia as a whole, certainly declining in population, but the birth rate in the Caucasus and the birth rate amongst the Muslims in Russia is almost 3 times or 2.5 times replacement rate, something like that. The birth rate in the ethnic Russian is like 3/4 replacement rate. So if you look at that and you measure it all out, in 2.5, 3 generations, Russia may be a majority Muslim and ethnic Muslim country, which for Russia is catastrophic. And so that is something where this long-term decline, what does that really mean? Well, it's important what it means for Russia, but just as important is what does it mean for us? Because that lends itself to a chaotic implosion as the ethnic Russians try to hold on to power and so many other entities are there within Russia. And some place it's got, I don't know, you guys know what, 6,000, 7,000 nuclear warheads, whatever they got. You guys know that better than I do. That chaotic implosion, that is not the way we want to see this go.
I have a good question. What is an ethnic Muslim?
The ethnic groups that are predominantly Muslim.
Right. So we have a couple of slides of.
Clicker works now.
Tartars,
Not
Bashkorkis,
technology anymore.
Caucasus, Ingushetians, Dagestanis.
These maps.
So groups that are ethnic groups that are predominantly Muslim.
Central Asia?
Not
And the Caucasus.
and the Caucasus, so large groups of Russia so Tatarstan, the city of Kazan on the Volga, predominantly Muslim there. Lots of different regions that have expressed desire to be either independent or much more autonomous.
Yeah, and so Russia's struggling with the problem of what is a Russian, right? Parker talked about the xenophobia. I would add that it's tinged with a little bit of good old-fashioned racism, right? People of darker skin, Russians look at as, even if they live inside the borders of the Russian Federation, many Russians look at them as not really Russian. The problem is, for them, so and they even have, they have these 2 words that they have one word that describes an ethnic Russian and another word that describes a citizen of the Russian Federation. So legally, you don't have to be an ethnic Russian or speak Russian as your native language to be a citizen of the Russian Federation. But I think there is a little bit of institutionalized kind of racism against non-ethnic Russians. As Parker said, the issue for them is that those are the groups that happen to be growing at much, much faster rates. So, this shows you the ethnic distribution, and this is the whole former Soviet Union, so it's a little misleading. But Russians are, this is, they're the red, they're the red in the group. And so they're mostly concentrated, in the western part of the Russian Federation, in European Russia. If you look at this map, this is just Russian Federation. Here's where all the Russians live. These are population growth rates. So they're all, the red's declining. The North Caucasus here, predominantly Muslim, Tatarstan, and then some of these other, the Asian groups that live inside of the Russian Federation. That's where population rates are rising. Populations are rising. So, if Russia had a true civic national identity, kind of along the lines of the U.S., where there is no ethnic or religious or linguistic test to be an American, this would not be a problem. But the fact that there's some kind of institutionalized, there's some xenophobia and maybe some institutionalized racism in the way Russia deals with its own people, much less immigrants. And I'm aware we're having our own debate about this now, and we're far from perfect, but the source of the problem is the way they look at, they answer the question of what is it to be a Russian. If they would bring all these other people, if they were kind of seen as Russian as the European Russian, they don't really have a population problem, demographic problem.
So you talk about they would rather be a problem than irrelevant. So there's a line there somewhere probably, or maybe not, for us. So we say that some of the stuff they do is noise and we should ignore it, okay? But does that not mean that the more we ignore them, the more problematic they become, so they're not irrelevant? And have you guys thought about where is the line and how do we find that? And then also before you talked about like their state of political understanding where they have they're very distrustful of everything we do. They're very fearful of things we do. They're fearful of things that we think is ridiculous that they're fearful of it. Do you think that's because that's the way they think and they are that way? They are conniving and underhanded?
So it's just a projection going on.
Right. If that's the case, how do you get inside that?
Right.
I don't know what you do.
That's a great question. Yeah. Are they assuming that since they would, if they had the capacity, foment color revolutions on our borders, are they assuming that that's what we're doing to them, right? Is that for as an example, for instance? Yeah,
And can you ever convince them that it's not?
Yeah, and this is why Olga Oliver, I think she's exactly right. She said Russia will always be hard to reassure and easy to escort. And so, and that gets back to kind of the fundamental dilemma right that I started with. They will see the West defending and protecting its own interests, showing resolve as threatening, and they will see attempts by us to compromise as weakness to be exploited, right? And so I think, frankly, in all of our lifetimes in this room, Russia's just going to continue to be a problem for us, and we're going to be a problem for them, frankly, because we just see the world in different ways. So we are going to continue to do things that they see as fundamentally against their interests, and they're going to do the same to us. What I think we need to avoid is accidentally doing things that cause escalation in the relationship. We need to defend our interests. We need to tell Russia when it's transgressed. But what we need not to do, Parker's example, I think of, NATO forces in the Baltics. And I'm kind of the same opinion. Like, I think the battle groups, that's fine. But, this idea that we need to drop, we need to equalize the balance of forces in the Baltics with
the Red Report, seven BCTs.
Yeah, 7 BCTs, right? And so
something like that.
Be careful. Be careful because, the RAND report and all it says, hey, look, it's only 200 kilometers from the Russian border to Tallinn, or 190 or something. It's only 160 from the Russian border to St. Petersburg. So look at it from their perspective. And I think if we drop 7 BCTs in the Baltics, they'll just escalate. And then you get into this security dilemma, right? By trying to make yourself more secure, you make the adversary less secure. What does he do? He reacts. And then you have arms racing and spiraling. And you could have war by misperception and miscalculation. That's what I think we need to be careful about. They're going to be a problem for us. We're going to be a problem for them, as long as probably all of us in this room are alive. We may have another reset. It won't last, because the structural contradiction in the relationship will cause it to degrade. Absent some fundamental change in Russia. We had one in 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union. We missed it. Yeah, I think we missed our chance. I don't know if you want to.
So speaking about fundamental changes, so it's that Russia's on decline, right? So eventually it's going to decline. But every time I'm looking at the map right now, you have all that green on one side. How homogeneous is that across as far as policies, culture, economics, and things of that nature? So on that whole eastern portion over there, it seems that there's the xenophobia and cultural differences and language differences that are over there. Is that going to be, you know, do they even defend that? Do they have control over that? Is that something that's over, you know?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. What somebody told me before I moved over there, what I saw was Moscow and St. Petersburg are not Russia. True statement. They are very, very European in nature. They lots and lots, tremendous, unbelievable amount of money. I lived there from 04 to 06. During that time, there were more billionaires in Moscow than any other city in the world, which says something, because this is not the world's most, the world's richest country. That wealth is concentrated in the West. So around Moscow, around St. Petersburg, in those cities and those areas that are oriented in the West, where most of the ethnic Russians are. The natural resources that fuel that wealth are far less concentrated in the West and concentrated in that expanse across Siberia. So whether it's the diamond mines in Yakutsk, or it's the gas all across Siberia, the timber, the oil, all of that sort of stuff, most of that is in the east, and that wealth is shipped via pipelines to whatever country needs it. But the rubles, dollars, euros, whatever they are deposited in the West. And so, kind of back to the basis of your question, is that heavily defended out there? No, for the size of the space, it's not like they've got, they haven't built a wall. They don't have a bunch of Russian soldiers standing along the border. They have had a border war with the Chinese some time ago. But there is not a dense military occupation out there. There is nothing that really defends that terrain other than the unbelievably vast size of it. The other aspect of that, in terms of homogeneity of that population, they're not. Now, are they generally speaking, aside from the stealth Chinese invasion, are they generally speaking Russian speakers? They are. Do they share a culture? Plus and minus, they have a shared history that is one of the things that that Russian leaders tried to bring everybody together on, and that's primarily the World War II history and the defeat of the Nazis, because frankly, the soldiers from this area in the east are the soldiers that saved Moscow. The Germans were 12 kilometers outside of Moscow. They brought the soldiers from the east in on trains. They got off the trains, did a ceremony, and marched them straight to fight the Germans and kept them out of Moscow. So there is this shared history from that perspective, but in terms of a lot of cultural homogeneity, certainly not ethnic homogeneity, it's lacking. It's not very deep.
So there are a lot of gaps in the
Tremendous number, yes. Which goes to the reason why, and I believe this, but Russians will also tell you that there is a requirement for a centralized government and an authoritarian leadership in Moscow. Because you cannot get that boat to go, to all the oarsmen in that boat to row all the same direction, if you have a decentralized government that allows, people to kind of go their own way and oblast and rayon governors to do whatever it is that they want to do. You've got to have a strong man who's going to beat people over the head to keep them in line.
You mentioned the possibility of luring intellectual capital out of Russia, which would seem to be a pretty effective way to speed their decline.
Yes.
What would the Russian response to a concerted effort by the West to do that be?
That's a great question. As I was kind of brainstorming of what we could do to both help ourselves and potentially injure the Russians in response to deterrence by punishment, in response to something that they did, I said, oh, maybe this would work. What would be their response? I think that they would just continue to demonize us. They would use that and frame that as, see, I told you they were trying to destroy Russia. And that's why it's not something that I would do that wasn't in response to a pretty significant action by the Russians. That's not something I just throw out there tomorrow and say, hey, we're going to implement this visa regime and we're going to pay all the Russian smart people to come over. It has to be something that is in response to something particularly egregious. as a deterrent by punishment, because it is something that risks, that again, if the government, Putin in particular, sees our steps as something that undermine his regime, that put the survival of his regime at risk, we risk escalation pretty significantly.
So then, what's your assessment of their domestic internal controls, like, you know, probably know what it was like under the Soviet Union, and then in the 90s, probably freed up quite a bit, but, I mean, is that even possible? Do they have freedom of movement? Could just anyone who wanted to get up and leave because we gave them a visa, could they do that? Or could that be stopped?
Yeah, so the ability of the Russians to travel to the West, specifically, especially into Europe, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of travel that continues. And, you know, and even here in the States, I mean, I run into, you go to New York City, you go wherever you go, you run into Russian tourists on a fairly consistent basis. So it's, that for vacation type of stuff, it's still pretty open. In terms of visas, work visas, that resident visas and stuff like that, it's a little more difficult for the United States. It's still pretty open.
So Russia's approach in like third world countries, such as like South America, Africa, do you see China's One Belt, One Road kind of reaching out? Do you see something like that for Russia as well?
Not, I would say not nearly to the scale or scope that China has. Russia doesn't have the resources really that China does. You know, like Parker mentioned, you know, the bombers to South America. You know, they've, in the Middle East, Syria and Iran are allies and partners of theirs. But they don't, they're starting to make inroads in Africa. They just can't offer what the Chinese can offer. They don't have the economy. They don't have the market. You know, China can offer a market of 1.2 billion people. China can offer an economy that's multiple times the size of Russia's. I just don't see them being able to compete with the Chinese in Latin America, Africa, and Asia.
It is, Russia is interesting insofar as they look at areas where we withdraw or ally, I'll use a different terminology. Allies or partners that we have abandoned would be the terminology that they would use, and they try to make some inroads. So in Egypt, when you look at al-Sisi in Egypt, so when the transition in government happened between Mohamed Morsi and al-Sisi in Egypt, call it a coup, call it a transition of government, call it whatever you want to call it, but our administration called it a coup, and therefore we cut off those ties, and we were the largest provider of military assistance for Egypt. Pretty quickly, Egypt started making, you know, some outreach between Russia and Egypt about potentially providing some military assistance. We saw some Russian advisors go in and set up station kind of on the border with Libya, with some potential of exercising their influence in Libya. We've seen the Wagner Group, the Russian mercenaries who have gone in and kind of set up some station down there. So I say all that to say they recognize that they can fill a vacuum on the cheap. It doesn't take a lot of resources to get a starving man pretty happy to have you in his backyard. So when you pull the rug out from under al-Sisi, for good reasons or not, that's not what I'm arguing here, but when you pull the rug out from under al-Sisi, he is looking for someone else to be his benefactor.
And the Russians and the Chinese, too, are able to do things that we're not able to do, right? They can go to an al-Sisi or I think it was Maduro and say, look, we're not interested in your electoral process, your human rights record. We're interested in being partners. They can, when I was in Pakistan, I was at ODRP for a year, 2013, 2014. We were, this is when we still had a military relationship with Pakistan, and we still had a robust security assistance program. The Russians were coming in, trying to sell them helicopters and saying, look, the U.S. is going to do human rights vetting, we don't care. The U.S. is going to take you 3 to 5 years to deliver the helicopters, we get them here in 3 months. And so they're just looking to undercut us, undermine us, fill a vacuum where they can. So their advantages are, no human rights vetting, no scrutiny of the human rights record. They can deliver aid quickly because they don't have the legal constraints that we do. They don't really have a legislature, that could say no. Their disadvantages are they don't have the bandwidth, they don't have the deep pockets, that China has with the U.S.
Who wants to fly a hind when you can fly an Apache?
One more question is, so what's their winning strategy? So what's their narrative, right? So first of all, in declining population, not a strong economy, not reaching out. Where do they see themselves in the future in order to what's their game plan?
I think we both said it in different ways. They want to be a pole in a multipolar world, right?
Like, how do they think they're going to get
How do they think they're going to get there, right? That's the end. You know, what are their ways and means to get there? Well, it's really, I think most of their goals are negative. It's to bring the United States down, to erode the power of the United States. They know that kind of long-term, their prospects aren't great. So to the extent that they can undermine, weaken, erode the power of the United States, and this whole narrative in Russia that the West is in decline, the West is decadent in decline, is pretty strong. And I think many of them, Russians actually believe it. To the extent they can accelerate that process, it's in their interest. And that's how, so the emergence of a multipolar world is not, you know, Russia coming up to the level of the United States, it's more Russia bringing the United States down to its level. Yeah, exactly.
And that erosion of multipolar world also talks about an erosion of what they view, and frankly we view of, as a world order that supports our hegemony. And so you erode that, and they look at that world order, the world order as it stands today, as something that is disadvantageous to them. So if they can disrupt that world order, that is, create this multipolar world where they are a pole of that, then the glass ceiling, if you will, that has been put over their success is removed, and then they have the capacity to perhaps not be a declining nation. Now, there's a lot of foundational things that have to change, but that's a different conversation.
I'm going to open it up to one or two more. Actually, those two hands up, we'll do that because I want to be courteous to the next group who's coming into the theater. It's 45, so let's try to wrap this up in the next 5 or 7 to 10 minutes and be courteous to the next group. So you two that had your hands up.
Yes, sir. So I was wondering, you talked about information operations and establishing red lines. So what are the institutions and means that we can use in order to establish what's acceptable practices and acceptable behavior in information operations and in the cyber realm, so that we can begin to either rein in that behavior or establish what our response is going to be to things that are subversive to our interests?
So specifically in the IO and kind of cyber realms, like how can we set kind of red lines?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, that's a great question.
We will be walking around the J2 spaces a little bit later today, so if you see us down there and one of those is going to trip into a little bit higher
Well, maybe not so much
classification,
cyber right now, but like information operations.
Yes.
How do we counter that narrative and not just play defense, but maybe take a little more offensive approach in the information operations to penetrate those ethnic groups out in the East. And
I think we have to be careful because we don't want to destabilize Russia, right? As much as they believe we would like to destabilize Russia, I do not believe it should be a core U.S. interest to destabilize Russia, because that is the last thing we need. What we need is, we were talking on the way in this morning, what we would love is Russia to be a slightly more prickly, if there are French officers in the room, I'm sorry, but a slightly more prickly France. That defends its own interests, that doesn't reflexively side with the United States, that has its own view of the world, but nevertheless sees the world in mostly the same way that the West does, and is a partner with the West. How we get there, I don't know, because there are certain things about Russia that make me think that's, we in the 90s, serious people talked about Russia joining NATO someday. And so there's certain things about Russia that make you think that there's the possibility for Russia to emerge that could be a bigger, a little more sensitive, prickly, insecure France, right? A partner. And then there are other things that would make you think it's just not in our lifetimes, right? And so I don't know that I don't know if we should play offense in the information operations world. I mean, Do we want to destabilize the Putin regime? We don't like the Putin regime. But I don't know what would emerge. Yeah, who else? Alexei Navalny, right? He's the big, anti-corruption. Putin is at least a pragmatic Russian nationalist, right? I don't think that he really believes some of the more kind of xenophobic and racist tendencies that you see in Russian society. He uses those when they're useful to him, but he's always very careful not to whip things up to too great an extent. Navalny, I think, embodies a little more of that kind of Russian nationalist xenophobic view. So I don't know if he'd be any better. He might be less corrupt than Putin. The other guy is Zhirinovsky, who is a radical Russian nationalist. He's the guy who talks about taking back Alaska and everything. And so, he's still there. You have the communists, who at least aren't nationalists and racists, but they're communists, right? So we dealt with a communist Russia for the whole Cold War. So there's not a lot of alternatives right now to the regime around Putin. So trying to play offense and destabilize it, we would have to be very careful not to destabilize.
Purely from a defensive perspective, though, you can often say that a good offense is some of the best defense. But from showing the capability, you do this, you're going to reap this result. As a way to play defense, to get him to stop interfering in even not even countries that are bordering, but pretty much everywhere, Africa.
I think there's kind of two aspects, and I'll touch on these real quickly so we can get to that last question. So part of it is, and this kind of goes to that deterrence by denial piece. We got to clean up our own backyard. I mean, if these countries that Russia seeks to influence, if we want them, I'm not talking Russia specifically, that would be great and everything, but let's just talk about the countries in their periphery that are leaning towards authoritarianism or have gone whole hog towards authoritarianism. If we want them to aspire towards some sort of liberal value so that we can all live together and sing kumbaya, we kind of have to make sure that the shining city on the hill that we like to think of ourselves, that we really are the shining city on the hill. So, and I know that this is my own kumbaya moment, but if we don't clean up our electoral process, our politics, how divisive we are, if we don't do that, then what are we showing? So the best information operations we can have is to be the people that we say that we are. I don't know that's overly simplistic, and I got that. But we are certainly, I don't think there's a coincidence that we're seeing this rise in nationalism and move towards authoritarianism in many places, this retreat of democracy. I don't think there's a coincidence that we're seeing this at the same time that we're seeing all this dysfunction in some of what are supposed to be the most accomplished and successful democracies in the world. What model are we showing? So that's one aspect of it. The other piece that I would say, and this kind of, I said that this messaging piece and ensuring this deterrence by punishment. You have to find something that they value and you have to put it at risk. Threaten to impose costs. But the bottom line is, and I hit on it, I can't hit on it strongly enough, those have a risk of destabilizing the regime or of the regime perceiving that they will destabilize the regime. You cannot take those actions unless you have drawn a clear red line and said there will be significant consequences associated with crossing this red line. Be very, very clear of what those consequences are. Because if we pull the trigger on something that they perceive destabilizes the regime, like Bob said, if Putin goes away, who's in the wings? Probably somebody that we don't want, someone who is less predictable. One of the things that we talk about all the time is Russia, is it Putin or is it Putinism? Has he created something that now exists in Russia that the next person is just going to step into and will just be Putin version 1.1? Or when Putin dies and is rotting in the ground, is that an opportunity for real change with Russia? I think it's more of a Putinism because I think it's a structural issue and not a person.
Putin won't rot the ground. They're going to bomb him.
That's right. Put it right next to the center. That's exactly right. All right, one more.
Yes, we really have to capitalize into his question just a minute ago, but one of Russia's greatest fears is color revolution occurring within Russia. So I guess my question would be, how susceptible do you foresee Russia as being to a color revolution and ramifications to one occurring?
So they do believe that our ultimate intent, they do believe that we manufactured all the color revolutions. And when I say they, I mean, certainly the Russian foreign policy and national security elite. To what extent Drill, the man in the street believes it, I think he or she probably believes it as well. So they do believe that. They do believe the ultimate intent is to destabilize or topple the Russian government. Again, I would ask them to what end? So let's assume that that's our goal. What do you think? Do you think we want to run Russia? We don't want to run Russia, right? They're having enough trouble running it themselves. We don't need to do it for them. So I guess, how do you get to that threat perception, right? How do you, and that's kind of, I guess, what I was going for in the last bullet of my last slide. It said, don't, exactly what it said, don't put Russian sovereignty at risk, but also resist their attempts to destabilize or erode the sovereignty of their neighbors. Here's another one they did to us this year. You've got a lot of slides. Last slide. Yeah, forget it. But I just think we have to, like I said, be resolute but be predictable, right? We have to make it clear to Russia that it is not in our interest to destabilize the Russian government. We put ourselves in a little bit of a box here because, Congress makes the State Department write a report every year on kind of every country. And so the State Department every year says Russia's not a democracy, the elections aren't free and fair, human rights are suppressed. They see that as an attempt to erode or undermine them. We see that as kind of, first of all, the executive branch, congressional oversight, Congress makes them do it. They would rather not, I think the White House would rather not write some of those reports of the State Department. But the Russians see that as
Meddling in their
internal affairs. Exactly. And so we just, I think, have to be clear that it's not in our interest for the Russian government to be destabilized. We would like to see true democracy, not sovereign democracy or managed democracy emerge in Russia, but it's not a core U.S. security interest to try to accelerate that process from outside or to destabilize Russia.
Sorry, I got to ask that we do this in closing. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, real quick. If you could go to your last two slides, because I think, after all this heavy stuff.
Oh, yeah, those.
Yeah, no, you need to show.
You mean the last two?
Yes,
yeah,
sir.
So, if you Google it in Soviet Russia, there's a dozen of these at least out there. This one I actually am really proud of next because I made it myself during the shutdown. But anyway, these are out there on the internet. There are also some great Russian propaganda videos that we have links to in here that are out there on the internet.
I will ask, I don't believe this is proprietary, but we'll try to get this up, and I'll be the point of contact for sending this out, and then we'll try to hang it on some of the STRATCOM pages as well. Again, barring we'll go through that, make sure there's nothing in there. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. And again, the last thing, if anybody wants to do this, get with the J14 guys, steal Strat Talks. I stole it from TED Talks, but this is what we want to do, is a forum like this with people like you from STRATCOM, because Heighton said, General Heighton said, excuse me, I don't want to call him by his last name. Integration is everybody's, that's everybody's responsibility here. Sometimes we get in our cubicle deflated and we're not doing what we need to do. So, thank you very much.